Uh, Everyone who is joining from different parts of the world, we welcome you on behalf of IACA and Wild Justice Commission. We have joined hands, and this is the time that we have to discuss a very important issue. As all of you know, wildlife is an important part now, and it's one part of the major universal problem today is the climate change. And it deals with not only wildlife, but also deforestation. And there are several issues where corruption becomes a major problem. So I welcome all of you to hear the eminent panelists with us. And on behalf of IACA, which is, as you all know, it's an international organization and as an academy. And IACA has several programs. We have master's programs, we have postgraduate diploma program, we have masters in new masters we have launched in the Spanish program, and several online courses which people can make use of. And certainly this endeavor which we have, this is series of panel discussions. Now this is the second, and I'm sure that we will continue doing this and look into the major issue relating to corruption in every aspect. So without taking much time, I thank you, all of you, for joining. And on behalf of IACA and the Wildlife Justice Commission, we will continue to do our endeavor. And I then hand over the floor to Murray, who is here from the side of IACA, and then, of course, our moderator, Mr. Edward Ivanov, who is part of IACA, and I'm glad that he is moderating this event. So over to Marie.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marie from the Academic Programs Department, and I'm very happy to see all of you and to see such great interest in the subject. And I would like to quickly introduce a few of our projects from the Academy, which are currently open for application. The first one is the Postgraduate Diploma in Anti-Corruption Enforcement. It is a one-year postgraduate diploma and expected to start in March next year. As you all know, corruption plays a major role in fostering all types of crime, such as human trafficking, anti-money laundering, cybercrime, and many more. Fighting against corruption is demands vigorous investigative bodies, powerful enforcement agencies, and efficient mechanisms for overseas cooperation and networking. Therefore, it is important, very important even, to study the nexus between corruption and such types of crime. And we are very happy to offer this diploma, which covers all of these aspects. And we are encouraging all of you who are interested in it to apply by January next year. Coming to another program, the second one is the Executive Diploma in Anti-Corruption and Diplomacy. It is delivered remotely and part-time and over the course of 6 months, and in collaboration with UNITAR, which is the United Nations Trainings and Research Institute. The diploma combines IACA's expertise in anti-corruption and UNITAR's expertise in diplomatic skills, which trains our participants to work efficiently in various multicultural contexts, while equipping them with a very important state-of-art knowledge of anti-corruption. This is also an excellent opportunity for all participants from all over the world. And currently, we're still accepting applications for these 2 diplomas, and also offer a great variety of online training. So at IACA, we believe that innovative education for professionals dealing with corruption is a crucial part of the global fight. And yes, this is my quick introduction in our ongoing applications. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us and to visit our website or write us an email to studies@iaca.it. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening for some of you, depending on your time zones. I'm Professor Edward Ivanov, Senior Researcher at IACA, and I'm very glad to moderate this event. Today, we discuss the nexus between corruption and environmental crime. Protection of environment is one of the global challenges for the international community and international law. It sounds like something obvious, but in our daily life, we don't think much about global issues. And I think it's time for all of us to realize that environmental crime destroys our planet. And it's a high risk that our children or our grandchildren will see many animal species only on the internet, but never in real life, because we cannot stop activities of criminal groups in this field. Criminals who don't care about environments and who care only about numbers on their virtual bank accounts and don't understand that these virtual numbers cannot buy new air, new animals, and at the end of the day, a new planet. In my understanding, there are several conditions critical for criminal groups acting in the field of environmental crime. First of all, licensing. That is important for some types of criminal activities here, for example, in the fisheries sector. Then also opportunities to cross state and customs borders. And finally, opportunities to receive payments for criminal activities and use this, or if necessary, to legalize proceeds gained from these criminal activities. So I'm very glad that we discuss these issues today. And I would like to introduce our panelists. Olivia Swag-Goldman is the Executive Director of the Wildlife Justice Commission. Olivia has 25 years experience in international justice and diplomacy. She has published extensively on issues of international criminal law and international humanitarian law, and served as a lecturer for both Harvard and Leiden universities, actually leading universities in international law. We also have Mashoudi Masifa, who is a qualified lawyer with a commercial law background. She was appointed as a legal researcher with a focus on the extractive industry at Transparency International South Africa Corruption Watch. Mashoudi leads a sustainable mining program through the lens of financial transparency, anti-corruption, and human rights objectives. Within her time at Corruption Watch, she has published several research reports which focus on anti-corruption remedies, government sustainability, and legal policy in the mining sector. And last but not least, my colleague Atuveni Tupochile Akbermoji. Atuveni is anti-money laundering expert with 10+ years of experience. Atuveni previously worked as a Director General of the Financial Intelligence Authority of Malawi. She is currently serving as an MLCFT advisor with UNODC regional office in Southern Africa, and her work includes assisting countries in the region in building their capacity to combat all forms of serious organized crime. So we'll start our panel discussion that will consist of 2 parts. We'll first discuss the existing issues and challenges, and then discuss the possible solutions. And all the panelists will share their ideas and experiences. I really hope that we will have a very interactive panel discussion, and all the speakers will appreciate receiving your questions in comments in chat. After the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A session, and we'll try to answer all your questions and try to develop best solutions to address environmental crime and corruption. So let's start with a general analysis of existing issues and challenges in the field of environmental crime and corruption. And I would like to give a floor to Olivia. So Olivia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Edward, and thank you to IACA for not only convening this really important discussion, but also for including the Wildlife Justice Commission in our partnership. We're really, really pleased and think that together we can bring a lot of attention to this issue and hopefully make much more effective enforcement regarding environmental crime and corruption. Now, as many of you know, environmental crime is a huge industry. It's worth about $110 to $281 billion a year. So there's enormous amounts of money being earned from these crimes. In terms of the economic consequences of just wildlife crime, timber crime, and IUU fishing, the World Bank estimated that this is between $1 to $2 trillion a year. So there's just a lot of money being earned and a lot of economic consequences for the countries involved. So it's really important that we recognize the seriousness of these crimes. And as Edward mentioned, it's huge impact on the environment and biodiversity, the real risk that our children and grandchildren will only be able to see some protected fauna and flora on the internet. But it has even bigger impacts than that. It relates to climate change, and ocean health and forests are so important for for the climate. It addresses rule of law, and if the police aren't enforcing, law enforcement aren't enforcing the rules around wildlife crime and the corruption, then there's a lack of belief in the rule of law by citizens, which is so devastating. I think we're all experiencing the role of that it can have with human health. So it's much closer to us than you would think. It's not something far away. And also in terms of addressing money laundering and tax evasion as well. So real loss, not only economically, but also in terms of the structure of society. So environmental crime has much broader impacts than only on the environment. It's important to keep that in mind. Corruption is we call it an enabler of environmental crime. So without corruption, you wouldn't have environmental crime. It's just impossible. You need those corrupt officials and businesses in order to be able to move the product and to get it through the supply chain. And the Wildlife Justice Commission has investigated numerous. We go for the high-level criminals. We look at the supply chain across the world, and in almost all of our cases, we've seen a lot of corruption. So it's there throughout. And there's also a big sense of impunity for the corrupt actors. So they're not afraid of getting caught. They really think that they can operate in this vacuum. So that's important to keep in mind as we seek to address this issue. Corruption is also fundamentally linked to certain environmental crimes, in which case they couldn't occur without it, such as illegal logging, where it's very, very hard to hide the product and to identify it. So these are really intricately related. And specifically in terms of the illegal wildlife trade, we've seen corruption enable it through the entire supply chain. And it's actually one of the biggest challenges to law enforcement to be able to address environmental crime is corruption. And we see it in a variety of different ways. We see it in the process of applying for permits and other kinds of documents, or at border controls, where border guards are asked to look the wrong way, or in terms of giving a heads up that there'll be increased enforcement at a certain location, or that corruption enables a lack of prosecution, so they pay off the judiciary in order not to be prosecuted. So it really goes through a variety of different issues. So there's no one set way that corruption enables environmental crime, but it's much broader than that. And some of the things we've seen are warnings about police activity, payments for protection or lack of prosecution, selling back seized goods. We've seen that quite a bit, in fact, that governments will seize enormous amounts of wildlife product, and then those products will leave the government facilities through corrupt officials. And in the private sector, bribing individuals and businesses associated with the trade to facilitate. So whether it's fake bills of lading or other things like that. So there's a variety of different ways, and we need to be really attuned to these in order to be effective in addressing them. Now, we all here know that environmental crime is a big issue, but not everybody does and hasn't traditionally focused on it. Enforcement is focused on other forms of serious organized crime. So whether it's drug trafficking or human trafficking or weapons, they've gotten the majority of the attention from law enforcement, and thus the majority of the resources needed to address it. And until recently, environmental crime hasn't been treated like serious organized crime. It's kind of been sort of I think it's been an emerging issue in talk for years, and it's arrived. It's serious organized crime. So in order to effectively address it, we need to raise awareness that this is serious organized crime and devote more resources to addressing it. Because it's only with the more resources and the more attention that we're going to be much more effective in addressing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Yes, I fully agree with you that crossing borders or transferring funds is not possible for criminals to do this without corrupt officials supporting their activities. But we observe these global issues that law enforcement authorities and policymakers underestimate the role of environmental crime and don't pay enough attention. What do you think, what is one concrete way to increase the prioritization of environmental crimes by policymakers?
Well, in order to increase prioritization, it's like with anything, we have to show them why it's important for them. So we need to show that by addressing wildlife crime and environmental crime more generally, we can have a much broader impact. So at the Wildlife Justice Commission, we looked at what the convergence is between wildlife crime and other forms of serious organized crime. And we found a tremendous amount of overlap. So whether that means wildlife with fisheries, so within the sort of environmental sphere, or much broadly, we saw corruption in almost all of our cases. We saw links with drug crime, we saw links with human trafficking. So to show why by going after environmental crime, even if that's not your primary purpose, you can have a much broader impact. And in order to do that, you can work, we need different law enforcement authorities and different authorities more generally to work together. So if we can get the customs to work with the serious organized crime police, to work with the drug enforcement, to work with the border crossing, that's going to make us much more effective and increase the prioritization, because suddenly everybody's looking at these issues from their own perspective and with their own mandates, because different authorities have different mandates and different legislative tools that they can use. There are some best practices about doing this. It doesn't happen nearly enough, but there's a great example that from the US government in Operation Apex, which was a 2020 joint investigation between the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the DEA. And they looked at a network that was trafficking in marijuana as well as shark fins in Totuaba. So they ended up really being able to map this network out, and 12 people were arrested and 2 businesses. And what's really interesting about it is, despite the vast amounts of wildlife product that they saw in being trafficked by this network, in the end, the indictments didn't even address it. They were charged with drug trafficking, money laundering, wire fraud, and mail fraud. So sometimes you can use a variety of different tools and a variety of different legislative options in order to address these issues and increase the prioritization. So that's a really important aspect that I think that that could help get more attention for wildlife crime. And just one final note is, in our own work at the Wildlife Justice Commission, what we've seen is because environmental criminals and wildlife criminals in particular aren't necessarily expecting this prioritization by governments, they're not necessarily as operationally savvy as other forms of criminals operating in different areas, such as drugs, where there is more attention. So it can also be an easier way to get into the networks than working through a more traditional drugs approach, for example. So it can have the added benefit of making it a little bit easier to get into these networks. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. And yeah, we can use various approaches and various tools. Based on my personal experience of money laundering investigation, I know that criminals, especially serious criminals, leaders of criminal groups, prefer to hide behind complicated corporate structures, behind numerous front persons, intermediaries, etc. And it's also important to enhance transparency. So, Mashudi, what do you think about the role of this mechanism of identification of ultimate beneficial owners? Can this mechanism help to prevent and combat also wildlife crime and related corruption?
Yeah, thanks, Edward, and good day to all the attendees to this webinar, and really thank you to IAC for inviting Corruption Watch to sit on this panel to discuss something that is of critical importance. When we're speaking about beneficial ownership opacity, we're really discussing essentially the reality that for many years, corporate entities, because of the muscle and the power and the influence of that corporate entities have, particularly those entities that have significant amount of revenues that even surpass GDPs of certain nations. And the ability that those companies have to hide behind corporate structures and corporate arrangements, and still be able to disperse a lot of the risk into communities and into environments and contributes to environmental crime. So what we're talking about is not just identifying the company name or shareholding or directorship. We're talking about a level of transparency that allows for you to identify who actually controls, who owns, and who's the ultimate benefactor of a corporate entity or arrangement of corporate entities. And things like your Panama Papers, your Pandora leaks, and the Gupta leaks here in South Africa, famous here in South Africa, illustrate the difficulty that comes with identifying beneficial owners or beneficial ownership, because it is very complex and there's a depth and sophistication that comes with establishing these corporate entities. But the contribution that these companies have towards corruption and environmental crime is immense, because you have policy considerations and legal provisions that allow for the protection of individuals. And most civil society organizations, when we talk about beneficial ownership transparency, we're talking about creating a platform where that is not possible, where you're enabling citizens to hold individuals accountable for corrupt conduct and some of the risk that is associated with some of the companies that operate in vulnerable jurisdictions and vulnerable sectors. And the scale of the problem when you're talking about the opacity of beneficial ownership is actually it's incredible. I think one of the most notable reports that have come out from the World Bank is the 2011 Puppet Masters report. And that report really illustrates the level at which anonymous shell companies have been used in corruption. This report was specifically looking at 150 grand corruption cases across the world, and the World Bank identified that 85% of these cases there was a use or misuse of companies in aiding corrupt activities. So the scale of the problem is very clear. And when we narrow it down to environmental crime, as Olivia has mentioned, it's quite an interesting aspect, because it's almost a melting pot of different aspects that lead to the corruption in this space. For example, when you're talking about environmental crime, you have to then look at what are the vulnerable sectors that enable that. It's one of the most noticeable sectors is in extractives. Extractives is a massive contributor to the climate change crisis and ways in which we're going to manage that. But it also, when you're talking about beneficial ownership in the extractive space, you want to know who is the license holder, who is extracting commodities, not only for the collection of resource rents for a country, but because when you're talking about a business unit in a particular area, you're talking about flows of money and vulnerability of that entity to contribute to illicit financial flows. But then it also opens up this web of enabling the environmental crime, whether it's in the business operations of that unit in terms of how it disperses its waste, or in the use of that land, or the access or the trade-offs of that commodity to different countries. So it really is, it requires a quite targeted approach in dealing and addressing some of these corruption risks.
Yeah, Mashudi, thank you. Yes, countries actually pay a lot of attention to identification of beneficial owners. They have different approaches. Some of them decided to establish registers of beneficial owners. Some of them establish obligations of companies to know, at least to take measures to identify their own beneficial owners. But what do you think, how can beneficial ownership data be enhanced to combat corruption? What are the actions required to enhance beneficial ownership information to reduce the use of anonymous company structure? What would be your advice or ideas about it?
No, I think with that it lies mostly in what you've mentioned, that different jurisdictions apply different standards and understand beneficial ownership differently. But I think in order to enhance the data of beneficial ownership in such a way that it actually addresses the corruption risks, I think really two broad things. The one aspect is in relation to really having a international level of cooperation. And we're seeing a lot more of this more noticeably with what's been happening within FATF. We recently participated in the private sector meetings of FATF, where there's a change in the understanding of beneficial ownership, to the sense where it's no longer seen as a disincentive for the level of transparency that civil society has been advocating for, but really looked at as the ability for governments to look exactly at how much money is being lost as a result of beneficial ownership opacity, and how much money can actually be saved by having the kind of reforms that civil society has put forward in terms of access and transparency. And the other aspect, I would say, really to enhance data, is to really look at innovative ways of collaboration with strategic partners. It's never going to work in having a siloed approach. I think really engaging with governments, with private sector, with donor governments, with philanthropic communities, and so on. Those are ways in which you can establish partnerships in order to address some of the transparency reforms that we're looking for. And there is really an ability for getting lessons learned from your standard setting bodies that encompass a level of transparency. For example, in the extractive space, you have the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which is a standard of transparency within the extractive spaces of the implementing countries of the particular standard. And while the standard is focused on extractive's form of transparency, in implementing that standard, governments need to have a full, robust reform of their policy and institutions in such a way that all sectors benefit from transparency and will enable clarity insofar as flows of monies are concerned.
Thank you, Mashudi. Yes, of course, enhancing of transparency of the corporate sector, of companies and corporate infrastructure is very important, and generally speaking, prevention is very important part. But of course, it's not always possible to prevent crime, and still we have to detect and investigate crime of corruption and environmental crime, including financial investigation. Atuveni, could you please share your experience of financial investigations related to the topic we discussed today?
Thank you very much, Edward. I will provide insight with reference to a case that happened here in Malawi some few years back, involving where there was illegal wildlife trade involving 7 Chinese nationals and 2 Malawians. They ended up, each one of them, being sentenced between 3 to 11 years of imprisonment. So in this particular case, you had a family involved. There was a father, a mother, son, and their son-in-law. They were involved in the actual crime, but they used locals to open bank accounts, to start businesses, to register cars. There was also a shell company that was opened in the name of the daughter, and all these were used to launder the proceeds from the illegal wildlife trade. Now, when this case initially came up, when the illegal wildlife was identified, which included quite a vast number of things, including rhino horn, pangolin scales, you had hippo teeth, ivory chopsticks, whose value was approximately $54,000 US. So when these things were identified, immediately the police and the Department of Wildlife started working together. And at that point, it was then decided to bring in the Financial Intelligence Authority to look at the financial aspect. Now, I should say that until this time, this was not traditionally how wildlife crimes were investigated. Most times it was just investigation. You have you charge them with possession, and you try them, you confiscate the trophies, and they are sent to prison. In fact, before the new wildlife law, most of the penalties were fines. So there was no incarceration involved. But in this particular case, these people were incarcerated, and this set a new standard for the country. But what was interesting about this was that the financial investigation aspect is what brought about a realization that, one, with wildlife crimes, just like any crimes, people will try and hide their steps. So for the first time, I think in the country, there was a realization that people don't commit this crime just for the trophies, just for the wildlife, that there is money involved and the money goes elsewhere and the money is invested. Because then it revealed that not only were they shell companies, but this particular family had amassed wealth beyond measure. So you had instances where they had bought a farm, they had even bought a mine. And obviously this was following from the proceeds of crime. So all this was able to be identified. People were able to trace this and to see that, okay, this is where the money went. This is how much money they were able to take out of the country. There were no real significant transactions in their accounts. And so all this was meant to mask the illegal activity that was happening at the time. So what has resulted out of this is that because of this setting the precedent, you can now see that there is now a bigger drive to ensure that with every offense of wildlife crimes, there is money laundering charged as well. So this happens even before they've been able to see if there is actually property that they can seize or anything, but now money laundering has become a charge that comes along wildlife offenses. Another good thing that has come out of this is that because this was one of the biggest cases and a large number of not middlemen, because now we were able to go and get the actual kingpins. Previously, it was the middlemen or the people that actually do the hunting of the wildlife. But because this was a kingpin and it has shown that it is possible to try these people and to convict them and they're serving their sentences, it has given impetus to law enforcement, to both investigators and prosecutors. So one prosecutor I spoke to actually told me that they want to try and do an asset forfeiture, not just to forfeit the wealth that came as a result of the crimes that were committed, but to even say how much money did government spend in looking after the animals that were killed? Because Malawi does not have rhino. Rhino is not endemic to Malawi. So Malawi does not have rhino, but the rhino that came were introduced into the country and they were being taken care of. So government spent money to bring the animals into the country and to look after them. So they want to try and ask the court to say even that money, the money that was used, these criminals should repay for the money that government spent, because this is money now that has been lost. So those type of innovations are good. Not only do they develop the jurisprudence around wildlife crimes, but it also sends a strong messages to those that are involved in these crimes, that these crimes are not just going to be looked at. Now, having said that, there are, of course, the challenges will always remain in terms of what challenges are faced for wildlife investigators and prosecutors. One that came out very clearly in this investigation was corruption. Corruption was very high. In the initial stages of the investigating this case, apparently one of the investigators, when he went to question the kingpin, he told him that, do you know who I am? You know that by tomorrow you can lose your job. And sure enough, this poor man, a day or two later, was transferred from his duty station to a duty station in a very remote area where he didn't even have indoor plumbing. And his daughter, his children were asking him, Dad, what wrong did we do to be punished this way, to be brought to this place? So that tells you that the issues around corruption and wildlife crime are real, and they have an impact in how investigations are done and what can be done, and that things still need to be done differently. But the success in this story also says there is hope. There is hope for more to be done. So thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed that short case study.
Yeah, thank you very much, Utuveni. It's really a great example and very interesting approach of prosecutors, including the approach to the calculation of fines. But what was the impact of corruption on the case that you have just shared with us, if any?
I think the impact of corruption, as I've said, with the case of the policeman who had to move, that was something that really hurt the case initially, because everyone now who heard about it in law enforcement had some fear. And while working for the FIA myself, one of the things that came out of all this was that even to discuss this case, if we wanted to discuss something or we are following up something, we had to use special phones. So we realized that the possibility of conversations being listened to or people approaching us was very high, and therefore we had to do things differently. So corruption had the effect of, yes, bringing in some fear, but at the same time, it also had the impact of driving people forward, because everyone said, no, we can't let this happen. We cannot let people win because of corruption. We can do more in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Utuveni. There are already some good ideas regarding the possible measures that may be taken, but maybe we can take additional measures or look for additional solutions to enhance effectiveness of preventive measures and enhance effectiveness of investigation and prosecution. So, Olivia, I'm coming back to you. Maybe you could suggest additional solutions or additional measures that may be implemented by governments to increase effectiveness of preventing and combating environmental crime and corruption.
Sure, and thank you so much for the question. And again, I'm going to look at it from the context of the wildlife crime, which is where we have focused on the most, and on the issue of crime convergence and how that can be used to find solutions to these issues, because it's really, we think, one of the ways in which we can be really effective in addressing this. There are a few key issues related to what I was talking about earlier, which is the lack of prioritization. How do we get that prioritization? We think there's several. The first is the use of intelligence analysis, the collection and sharing, and that's what we've seen is missing in most efforts by enforcement authorities to address this issue. Now, as many of you know, intelligence can be a real force multiplier. All countries have limited resources. They have to choose where to put their resources. And if you use intelligence analysis, that'll help you figure out much more clearly where you should be putting your resources. So that's something that we think is really important. It'll show which individuals are key, which networks are key, who you should be focusing on where. So we would say that that's something that can help address this issue. And that includes kind of the standardization of data collection. It makes it much more easier to compare then and to address these crimes in a more effective way. And use intelligence to find the convergence with other crimes, again, in order to get other agencies interested and using their resources and their mandates to address it. So the intelligence is to address the prioritization, and the corruption related to environmental crime is one of our key recommendations. We also think law enforcement should make greater use of specialized investigative techniques. We know about them from other forms of organized crime, addressing those forms, but they're not done nearly enough in addressing environmental crime. And think about sort of, when we talk about specialized investigative techniques, we're talking about trackers, listening devices, controlled deliveries, really those kind of advanced techniques that help us to get to across the supply chain and get, as Judy was saying, to those key individuals. So no longer just the poacher, for example, but to the high level person. The third issue that we would look at would be, or recommend rather, would be to do parallel financial investigations. Tune also mentioned that, but that's really, really important. So to get to the money, to get to the private sector as well as public sector institutions that are facilitating this, something Eduardo Pescaglia has talked a lot about, which is not only doing taking the money in terms of asset forfeiture to penalize the individual, which is so important so that they don't want to be involved in this crime as well, but also to use it as reparation. So that's really important. The parallel financial investigation is key. And I would also say then, obviously, a parallel corruption investigation is also absolutely imperative. As we said, it's often government officials that are involved, and that can have such a devastating impact in addressing these issues. So through a deeper understanding of crime convergence, we can help increase the prioritization of environmental crime by using these 4 techniques.
But if I would ask you, what is in your opinion the one area where resources should be allocated to ensure that corruption is effectively addressed? What would you suggest?
Oh, hard to choose one. But I'll start with intelligence analysis, because what we've really seen, and in all of my work in the last 28 years working on international justice, what you see is if you really use intelligence, you can be much more effective in where you're allocating your really limited resources. As I mentioned, every government, every institution has limited resources. They have to choose where to put them. And if you use intelligence analysis, you're going to be much more effective in putting them in a place that can be impactful. And who are those individuals that if you take them out, they're going to have the most impact on the network or on the crime type. So I would say that. And then secondly, if I was given a backup option, and there's so many resources we can choose what to do with them, I would say the specialized investigative techniques to really invest in doing that. These are long-term investigations. These aren't quick wins, but they can be really effective if you take the time, if you go through the supply chain, if you do cooperation with other governments, so you're not just stopping at your border, because crime doesn't stop, as you said, Eduard. So really what we need to do is doing a long-term strategy in terms of intelligence analysis and specialized investigative techniques to get to those individuals that are absolutely key and the networks that are key to destroying our environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Yes, we are now discussing the possible solutions. And as we discussed already, there are various approaches in the countries. So, Mashudi, what do you think could be done in addition to enhance effectiveness of existing mechanisms of identification of beneficial owners and maybe verification of this information? What are the possible solutions? What is the best way?
Yeah, thanks, Edward. I think there's a lot of organizations and standard setting bodies that have developed numerous models in terms of getting verification of data, or systems that can be put in place for verification of data, getting auditable data, and so on. I think the real win here is really capacitating civil society organizations to the extent that civil society organization can participate in the scrutiny and the open debate of beneficial ownership data. Because beneficial ownership and broader financial transparency topics are complex and technical, which can result in civil society organizations not being incorporated in this particular area of addressing corruption. But from speaking from a civil society organization that advocates for a naming and shaming approach when it comes to findings of individuals that have been participating in corrupt activities, there's also a level of pragmatism that needs to be looked at, that in order for civil society organizations to create advocacy and relevant research, there needs to be the ability for civil society to be a part of those conversations, to have access to that data. And BO data is, by its nature, it's highly sensitive, and in corrupt systems, individuals will go to great lengths to hide and conceal the looting of resources, particularly of public resources. Therefore, when you have a framework that is aimed at transparency and accountability, it's only in as much as that system can guarantee the accuracy and reliability of information that civil society organizations can be a part of the conversation. But that's not the case in all jurisdictions. So it then becomes quite difficult for civil society to operate in a system that isn't open and transparent. But with the capacitation of civil society organization in these highly technical spaces, and for civil society to advocate for things like the importance of free media and press, the protection of whistleblowers, the promotion of the rule of law. That is crucial because that information and data comes from the ease of those factors, as we've seen with all of these leaks. So, there's definitely not enough hands on deck, unfortunately, and the benefactors of IFFs and BO more broadly are well-resourced, up-to-date, relevant data. So we really are at the back foot, but really solution comes with capacitating the individuals that are focused on scrutiny and open debate.
Yeah, thank you. And I also would like to ask, so we live in this quite challenging time of the pandemic crisis that has impacts on various sides of our life, including digitalization, the use of new technologies, and actually new technologies, I would say, have positive impact on transparency. But what are some of the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, public access to beneficial ownership information, and how this can be applied to achieve accountability? What do you think, Mashudi?
Yeah, I think during the COVID pandemic, what we were able to see on a really global level was really a focus and an emphasis on transparency insofar as procurement is concerned. So the accelerated levels of government procurement of PPEs, allowing for subsidized initiatives for vulnerable groups in different communities. And by accelerated, I don't necessarily mean fast-paced, I mean relaxation of policy and legislative provisions. And procurement ordinarily is highly vulnerable to corruption. But in this case, where it was quite accelerated across the globe, you have a heightened level of corruption. OECD came out with a beautiful report that illustrated the level of corruption that has taken place in some of your highly corrupt jurisdictions during COVID and the levels of procurement in that space. Procurement data is very rich data. You are able to pinpoint flows of money much easier than in beneficial ownership spaces. But anyone who's operated in anti-corruption and anti-money laundering spaces, for some reason, we never combine these two data sets. We never look at the data of procurement with the data that is needed in beneficial ownership opacity. So I think the lessons that can be learned from the COVID period was the way in which measures were put in place to try and link these two data sets to enable governments to really understand and see who exactly are they buying goods and services from, and how that money is being spent, and how to digitize it in such a way that taxpayers are aware of the spend and who and when and how frequent that this is happening. And I really think that is the gaps that are present in BO are found most likely in your procurement data. So really that is a key finding that has come through quite beautifully during the COVID period. And I think it's something in development of tools moving forward should be incorporated more efficiently or more seamlessly.
Thank you, Mashudi. Yes, it's really important always to identify real persons behind any corporate structures, behind any types of crime, and go after them. It's the same story as in the field of combating terrorism, for example, financing of terrorism. We have to identify real persons, have to go after them. Atuveni, question to you. What do you think can be done in addition to enhance effectiveness of financial investigations related to environmental crime and corruption? Do FIUs need more powers, better coordination with other authorities, more information, access to particular databases? So what in addition could be done? What do you think?
Thank you very much. Indeed, I think that for one of the things that could be done for FIUs, I think we have for the longest of time looked at FIUs as being administrative, and most of their work ends at doing the financial analysis, but not financial investigations. But slowly, I think there has to be a realization that depending on the region that the FIU is in, and depending on the role that the FIU has, there may be need to enhance the powers of the FIU a bit. So what I'm talking about is in other countries, you have law enforcement that is a little more advanced and therefore is able to do financial analysis and financial investigations. This might not be the case in all parts of the world. In Malawi, for instance, it has taken a long time for law enforcement to even just understand the concept of money laundering, to understand what it is, to understand the importance of following the money. Just to give you an example, Malawi passed its money laundering or law in 2006. The first investigation into money laundering only happened in 2013. That tells you that there's a complete mismatch. So as these concepts are being introduced, financial investigation, money laundering, financial intelligence units, there should be an understanding that from region to region, country to country, there'll be differences, and therefore that what we initially started out as the intention of the FIU should perhaps change. If I could also answer another question that was in the Q&A, someone asked, I think James asked about what can NGOs do in face of corruption to help those that are in law enforcement. I think, again, I would say that the NGOs, what they can do is to be flexible, to understand what are the issues and to respond accordingly. An example of that would be one NGO that was working in Malawi at the time that this particular issue was happening was really flexible. They were providing assistance to the FIU. So they were providing resources to be able to conduct investigations and other financial analysis. Now, knowing that they're an NGO, if they transfer funds through their bank to the FIU, there will be a record. And obviously, everyone knows that they are an NGO into wildlife. It's going to raise a lot of flags. We don't know who is listening, who knows, and it can cause a problem for the people that are doing investigations. They were willing to bring cash to the FIU as long as they receive a receipt showing that the money has been received. Then we would take the responsibility of putting it into our account. It was a long way of going around it, but they understood the risks that FIU officers would face if this was not done that way. So I think some flexibility and some understanding into the issues that are surrounding would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuveni. And one more question to you. Why do you think financial investigations in relation to environmental crimes are now more prominent?
I think the prominence is coming out as a result of realizing, previously, I think it was just, oh yeah, these animals are just dying. But I think it has now been seen that these trophies are put to other use. Maybe perhaps previously it was ornamental, it was mostly ornamental, but now we see that they are products of medicine and other things. And so therefore it means there is a lot of value that goes into that. And as a result, people are taking more interest. Then again, with coming in with concepts of money laundering becoming prominent, obviously people begin to say, what's the connection of this crime to money? And then of course, with organizations like the FATF asking that there should be a national risk assessment and you look at all the crimes that produce proceeds, that obviously sparks a lot more interest than before. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuveni. So actually, we started already answering the questions, and we are coming now to the Q&A session. And there is a lot of interesting questions already asked by participants. We all know that combating corruption has been becoming one of the priorities in the international agenda. In June this year, the first ever the session of the UN General Assembly took place and discussed anti-corruption issues specifically and adopted political agenda. Also, the United States administration, presidential administration, put serious attention to the anti-corruption agenda. And we all know that in June this year, the US President Biden published a memorandum and declared corruption as a threat to the national security. And actually this week, the US presidential administration adopted the national anti-corruption strategy. And it's a really great document that defines priorities of the country in this field. And I would like to ask the first question in the chat. Actually referred to the US President Biden, who is hosting a virtual democracy summit starting tomorrow, with corruption as one of the three themes. And this week, the White House issued this anti-corruption strategy. And the question is, what would the panelists like to see coming out of the summit on corruption and environmental crime? Let's imagine we have this summit. What would you expect? What would you like to see in this summit? What kind of questions or solutions? So who would like to take the floor and answer the question? So Olivia, maybe you can share your ideas. What could be discussed at such kind of high-level summit?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. I mean, in a way, this is a great opportunity because climate change and the environment is one of President Biden's key priorities. And now he said that corruption is used as a national security issue. So if the administration can link these two in a way to make those a top priority, that'll have an incredible impact because it'll trickle down. So it means every agency is not only mandated, but also told that these are things that they should be focusing on, looking at the link between corruption and the environment. And as I said, it's all a question of prioritization. So if we can get the US agencies to be pushing for looking at those issues and addressing it, not only domestically, but also in their foreign policy, in their work with others. As he said, that the fact that, you know, it took until, I think 2013, you mentioned in Malawi to do a first money laundering investigation. What about the corruption investigations? And if we can really look at that, not only from a whole of government perspective, then that link, so it's within the United States, but also the United States has a large footprint globally. I think that would be a phenomenal outcome of this summit. Thank you.
Ed Mashudi, what would you like to see in this summit if it would be organized?
Yeah, I think it's very exciting, and I think it really exemplifies the bold steps that is required by countries, particularly with the influence and power of the US, to make the kind of changes that is required in terms of addressing corruption, in terms of putting in measures that can be put in place that makes it quite seamless and effortless for collaborations, whether it's regional or whether it's within civil society or within strategic partners. So I think what I would prefer to get from this process is to really for it to open up the appetite of other countries, especially your major players, to make the similar kind of bold steps and really put themselves out there in terms of the kinds of transparency reforms that will allow for a lot more accountability.
Thank you, Otovene. Do you think it could be a great idea to have such a summit and to discuss the current issues and maybe to enhance the role of combating environmental crime and corruption, or request politicians to pay more attention to this issue?
Yes, I think that it is important for that to happen. And I think apart from them just paying more attention to it, they should be seen, there should be a way that paying attention is actually seen. So it shouldn't just be by word of mouth, but it's some action that really shows that, yes, we are beginning to pay attention to this. What that looks like at this point, I really don't know, but I think it is something that would be very important to happen. Yeah.
Thank you. And actually, colleagues referred to the US anti-corruption strategy. As much as I understood, one of the priorities defined in the strategies, cooperation with NGOs, with investigative journalists, support of activists, anti-corruption activists in different forms, and it will be one of the priorities, strategic priorities of US administration and US embassies. Yes, and I fully agree that NGOs can play a very important role in preventing and combating environmental crime as well, not only corruption? And another question asked in chat. I think the colleague refers to the experience of Philippines and asked how about creation of Office of Environmental Ombudsman, like in Philippines. Also in the Philippines, we have deputized prosecutors from the Department of Justice handling wildlife crimes. Do you think that establishment of this position, of this function, environmental ombudsman, can help to solve the existing issues? Could it be an effective approach?
Shall I jump in on this one?
Yes, please.
I think that's a great idea. I think when you have specialized judges and prosecutors, one, it becomes a priority for them because that's what they're assigned to do, and it shows a priority on behalf of the government as well. But also in terms of the knowledge and the skills, so they're very comfortable with bringing these cases. They know the latest, the latest, the nuances of the laws, and they're focusing on it. So I think, and then they can also build networks with their colleagues in other jurisdictions. I think the International Association of Prosecutors was actually looking at creating a group on wildlife crime prosecutors. They've done that for other prosecutors, for other crime types. But I think it's a great idea because it really kind of brings in that specialization and that focus. So I think that would be something that could be really useful for a variety of jurisdictions.
Great. Also, one of the colleagues raised the issue about protection of whistleblowers. What do you think about the existing mechanisms? Are they sufficient? Are they good enough? Or do we need to improve the existing mechanism of whistleblower protection, in particular in relation to environmental crime and corruption? So who would like to take the floor on this topic?
I'll take the first stab at it. I think when it comes to whistleblowers, it's fundamental to the work that we do in tackling corruption. There needs to be systems in place, not only at a national level, but really at a regional and international level where whistleblowers are protected and the well-being of a whistleblower is also considered. So things like mental health services that are available to whistleblowers, incentivization of whistleblowing in key sectors. And one could argue that environmental crime is a considerably key sector where you're looking at where there is reports of corruption that relates to environmental crime. There's some kind of incentivization that happens in that space. So it's critical to have whistleblowers in order for this thing of addressing corruption to operate to operate effectively. But it's also equally important to consider the well-being of the whistleblower, not just for us to receive reports and for us to analyze the kind of reports that we receive, but also the well-being and the protection of that whistleblower as well.
Thank you, Mashudi. Atuveni, what do you think about the whistleblower protection? What can be done in addition? I know you have huge experience of investigations and cooperation with law enforcement authorities. And it's always challenging for whistleblowers to decide to blow the whistle. There is a lot of risks. What could be done to increase effectiveness of existing mechanisms of protection?
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, my video is off. My bandwidth is misbehaving. But anyway, I think for whistleblowers, first of all, to get proper information from whistleblowers and for them to even come up, there really has to be a proper campaign to help them understand the importance of wildlife. This is a concept that many will understand if they have the right level of education and they know what we're talking about. But for most people in the villages where the wildlife is near them, they just look at them as any other animals. They don't really understand how it impacts them, how it impacts their land, how it impacts their culture. Even if you say, oh, people come and feed and money comes in, how does the money come in? So first of all, before you even begin to say we have whistleblowers to protect, you have to let the whistleblower know what it is they'll be whistleblowing about. What you mean by whistleblower? Do they just come and say, oh, we saw someone kill an animal? What is it that you want them to say, and how should they say it? And then you talk about the protection. Now, in terms of the protection, again, there has to be thought into the various levels of whistleblowers. Are you protecting at the lowest level? Is it the middleman? At which level? What sort of protection will be required? Because if it is someone who, as I've said, if it's somebody who is exposed, is in town, lives in town, the level of expectation in terms of how they should be protected as a whistleblower will be very different from somebody who has probably been approached to go and hunt an endangered species, and what their expectations will be very different. So there has to be a proper thought put into who are whistleblowers in the case of wildlife crimes, and how should we protect them? What are we protecting them from? Are we protecting them from corruption? Are we protecting them from threats to their life? So all that has to be thought about to come up with proper policies.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it's a very important topic, actually. First of all, yes, we have to explain what it's about, and then should create incentives and create clear reporting channels. And of course, in many areas, it's very complicated. We usually discuss in whistleblowing from, let's say, corporate perspective as a part of compliance management system, various whistleblower hotlines, protection mechanisms, but in the field of wildlife crime, it's completely different. And we should understand these realities. Olivia, what do you think about the whistleblowers protection? What would be your suggestion? What could be done at the international level, maybe?
Well, whistleblowers are absolutely key, because as we've talked about, a lot of this information is going through third companies, through others. So on the one hand, as Jenny said, we need to be sort of on the ground, letting individuals know what's protected, but also at the higher levels. So individuals in the companies that deal with the financial aspects of it, and they're putting their lives at risk very often in order to bring these cases to light. I think the United States has some pretty good legislation on whistleblower protection, and also on sort of the resources that can go to whistleblowers. The National Whistleblower Center in Washington, D.C. does a lot of great work on that, and I think it may be a model. I don't know that much about other jurisdictions, but certainly without protecting whistleblowers, we're not going to be effective in addressing these crimes, because you need the documentation, you need to be able to prove that individuals were involved, and that's often internal documentation and internal issues. So we need to be protecting them at the highest level, and giving them the resources that they need in order to feel comfortable in bringing these cases forward.
Thank you. And another related question asked by participants, by one of the colleagues: what is the role of investigative journalism in combating international wildlife crime? What journalists could do? Actually, I also referred to the US anti-corruption strategy and mentioned that this is one of the points made by the US administration, that journalists can play an important role in many areas, especially in highly corrupt countries, I believe. But in this particular field, what could be the role of investigative journalism? How journalists could help to prevent corruption or detect corruption and environmental crime? Who would like to share their opinion about this?
I can kick it off, and then the others
Please,
hopefully will join in. Some investigative journalists have done phenomenal work, really digging behind the scenes to figure out who's benefiting most from these crimes. There's a few collectives that have done great work, and I think there's one, ICPJ, or they've just done really a great job on looking into who's behind the banks, for example, and who's getting the resources and how it all worked out. So they can be absolutely essential partners in digging out that information and providing relevant information for authorities then to build on. So it's, on the one hand, it's getting that information, collecting it, digging in, and then the other hand is calling attention to it, because then it increases the pressure, if you will, on governments to be looking at these issues and to be bringing these cases. So they almost have a dual role. And I think we've seen that with the Panama Papers and others, in terms of the role that investigative journalists can play. And to the extent they they address these issues, they turn their power to environmental crime issues, I think they could be really a force multiplier and an incredible support to the other work that's being done by other stakeholders. Thank you.
And fully agree. It's really great opportunity to cooperate with investigative journalists who really dig serious cases. Mashudi, what is your opinion about this?
Yes, absolutely. I think, the topic of this series is really about how do we address corruption, and addressing corruption is as an emphasis or an importance must be placed on free media and press, and that goes hand in hand with the protection of whistleblowers, and with the promotion of rule of law, and what investigative journalists embody a little bit of all those aspects in terms of tackling the corruption and tackling the malfeasance that usually happens in environmental crime. I think when we place the importance of protection of whistleblowers, equally should be the protection of investigative journalists, because they completely go into they kind of like the Wild West, and they go in and really investigate and really put everything on the line in order to uncover the truth and track exactly what's been happening in that particular sector, and where there is high valued interests and really very well-resourced individuals that are involved in environmental crime. There's a really big risk that investigative journalists undertake in taking up these really key topics. So I think the importance that we place on the protection of whistleblowers should firmly also be placed in the protection of investigative journalists when we're talking about tackling corruption.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also colleagues from Madagascar shared the experience of the use of collective action mechanisms when various stakeholders join forces to prevent environmental crime. Atuveni, what do you think about the possible role of collective action? And the public sector, private sector, and NGOs can join forces and work together to develop effective preventive mechanisms.
I think this is something that would be very good and innovative. The challenge perhaps would be that in the private sector, they have to clearly define what their interest is. And in this case, I'm looking at, for instance, financial institutions through which many transactions could take place, both the corruption and even the proceeds of crime from illegal wildlife trade. Perhaps their interest would be with regard to ensuring that their facility is not used for such transactions. So therefore, that would make them lead the way. The only challenge, I guess, would be to then ensure that what to do with those that are in the informal market, because in some countries, not many transactions take place through the formal banking sector. So if the private sector does not see that they are adding value to the process, their involvement might be limited. So they would need to clearly map what the private sector has to bring on board, what the public sector has to bring on board, what the ordinary citizen has, what their benefit would be from doing such a collective action and driving it forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. What do you think about the role of collective action? Actually, I know that many collective action initiatives have great support of the international community and large enterprises, for example, Siemens Integrity Initiative. Could a collective action initiative play an important role also in this field? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important, like the more stakeholders we can get together and the more out of our silos we can go, the more effective we're going to be. But it's important to keep in mind that everybody has their own area of expertise, and it's important that we all stay in that area of expertise. So if we can join together in ways that it makes sense, for example, policy initiatives, feeding into that is really, really important, but probably you know, if we're collecting evidence, you want to be limiting that to either the government or to somebody that, or an organization that's mandated on behalf of the government. So what's important is to look at where our strengths are and work together in order to be, to bring those strengths to push the envelope further and further. But as long as we're all staying in where our expertise is. Can I just jump in for a second? I saw in the chat, there was a question about
Sure.
enforcement on the demand side, and absolutely, I hope I didn't indicate that all the enforcement should be done on the supply side. It's across the supply chain. That's absolutely imperative. And as everybody here knows, crime displaces. So if you're not being if you're being really effective in one country, the crime is going to displace to neighboring countries or other countries where the enforcement or the legal framework isn't quite as robust. So it's absolutely important that we address these serious organized crime issues across the supply chain. And you're absolutely right that we need to be addressing it in the demand side as well. And something we've been looking at the Wildlife Justice Commission is the Chinese enforcement mechanisms and how they've really scaled up their enforcement and then the displacement that this causes to other countries in the region. So we need to be addressing it from a sort of ecosystem approach, if you will, where we're looking at it across the supply chain and in regional aspects. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. So I think we are slowly going to the end of our panel, but we still have 10 minutes time. And I would kindly ask all the panelists to sum up their ideas, maybe in 2 minutes, and provide us concluding statements. What could be done? What are the possible next steps in preventing and combating environmental crime and corruption? Probably what could IACA do in this field? I would say that actually the International Anti-Corruption Academy also pays serious attention to many topics that we discussed today. For example, we have a special training for investigative journalists, Power of Pen. And investigative journalists share their experience in the frame of this training with colleagues and discuss some hot topics they have. Also, the Academy recently established Anti-Corruption Collective Action Center and will provide support to the collective action initiatives and specialized trainings how to initiate and maintain collective action. But I would kindly ask now the participants to take the floor and share, let's say, the final points, the most important points that may be considered by participants to increase effectiveness of anti-corruption measures and measures aimed at combating environmental crime. So, shall we start, Olivia, with you, if you don't mind?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to kind of round up a little bit. It's been, I think, a really interesting discussion. So from our perspective, the Wildlife Justice Commission, in terms of addressing environmental crime and corruption, the most important thing is to increase the prioritization of addressing these crimes, to raise its profile within multilateral policymakers, but also national policymakers and enforcement authorities. And that's where, again, what we talked about the summit of democracy and linking these two kind of priorities for the Biden administration could be a great opportunity. But until then, while we're waiting for the governments to kind of get with the program there, one of the things we can do is look at why it's important to be focusing on environmental crimes and the crime convergence. So the linking of environmental crimes with other forms of organized crime that maybe are higher on the prioritization list of governments and policymakers. So to link those. And then in order to address those issues, we need to be doing more in terms of investing in our intelligence capacity and utilizing intelligence-led work and investing in long-term investigations that involve specialized investigative techniques that take a long time, but to go exactly as we discussed through the supply chain, from supply to demand, figuring out what those companies are that are facilitating it or those financial institutions. So looking at parallel investigations into money laundering and corruption, etc. So it's a big wish list, I realize that, but I think if we can start with using intelligence analysis and specialized investigative techniques in terms of the role of corruption related to environmental crime and other forms of organized crime, I think we'll already be much further than we are today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mashoudi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Edward. And just to touch on a point that was made about collective action, I think, collective action it's an interesting one because when it works well, especially in addressing corruption. I think we've seen with organizations like EITI as an example, where there's been a form of collective action that accelerates transparency. I've seen it with OGP and things like that to different degrees on different jurisdictions on whether or not it's effective. So I think, it's one way of being quite innovative in addressing the issues of corruption. But, just to wrap up specifically on beneficial ownership, I think we're at a point where, following the multitude of meetings from FATF, where we're, how do we move the agenda forward? A lot of the work in the space is mostly at country level when we're talking about beneficial ownership transparency. And the reality with it is that it requires international cooperation in the same way that addressing environmental crime requires international cooperation. A large part of it is part of the illicit flows. So the question then becomes whether or not the current international structure supports BO and the changes that is required. And from an African perspective, from the continent, a large part of the norm setting of beneficial ownership is by OECD, but there's a clear governance gap as OECD is not globally representative. So the question of who's included in terms of benefits and who's included in terms of scrutiny is a whole other 2-hour session. But I think what is important is when we're talking about implementation of laws and policy, in certain cases, it could be that your national laws achieve what you needed to achieve if you have the right people at the table. So for example, Botswana has fantastic beneficial ownership transparency laws. And, whether or not you can put empirical evidence that shows that, they are actually receiving the data that is required by an international standard of BO is a different question. But I think really what needs to happen is that international cooperation is to filter down into willing political parties and willing governments, where there's a prioritization of key sectors and key aspects and vulnerabilities of corruption, which includes environmental crime, to ensure that there's a stopgap in the flows of money that is happening as a result of policies that are not effective. So I think it really is about having the right people at the table in formulating these policies and having the right kind of political will.
Edward, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Mashoudi. And Atoveni, what would be your final recommendations, suggestions, and ideas that can be implemented in the future?
My final thoughts would be to ensure that governments or that the international community finds a way of stressing the importance of financial investigations as they are linked to wildlife crime, that this becomes something that is so talked about that nobody has any opportunity but not to ignore it. So it becomes something that's talked about constantly and something that all countries realize the importance of doing it. Maybe even I could go so far as saying the same way that any request an FIU or any STR an FIU receives involving suspected terrorism financing is considered high priority. Maybe that should be the case with wildlife crimes, looking at how important this is, looking at how much of our environment is being devastated. Perhaps that's where we should go. So as a thought is to really prioritize it and make it a household issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwini. So I also would like to add some final points and final comments. We discussed very complicated subject today. There is no ideal solution, but I also would like to say that it's really important to raise awareness of governments, of politicians, of law enforcement officers, and civil society to explain the importance of preventing and combating environmental crime, to prioritize this. And we discussed today several good ideas how we can do this. But it's really important to continue this. It's also important to develop specialized trainings for various categories of stakeholders, of professionals involved in preventing and combating environmental crime and related corruption, including officers of law enforcement bodies, FIUs, etc. It's great that this topic has been becoming priority in some international organizations and bodies. For example, the Financial Action Task Force on Money Laundering finally started paying attention to environmental crime and related money laundering. And yesterday, the conference of the FATF took place, and colleagues from FIUs from various countries discussed also new opportunities and investigation of money laundering related to environmental crime. I would also say that it's really important to develop international cooperation in this field in the framework of various international organizations, including the International Anti-Corruption Academy, and join forces of all the stakeholders involved in preventing and combating environmental crime and related corruption. So, and of course, anti-corruption today is one of the priorities in international agenda. And despite of all, let's say, political disagreements between some states, it's important to have common understanding that this is the priority for international community. And I would say, make international law great again. Thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists for their great contributions. I would like to thank the White Life Justice Commission. We are planning the third webinar to discuss other interesting topics related to preventing and combating environmental crime and corruption. I also would like to thank on behalf of IACA all the participants for joining us today. And we are looking forward to have further interesting discussions. So